When I decided to retreat to the family cabin for a few weeks, I thought I was stepping into quiet. The cabin had been in my family for decades, sitting on the edge of a lake surrounded by tall pines, with no real neighbors for at least a quarter-mile. It was a place that carried history, memories, and an aura of peace I had longed for after years of stress. I expected silence broken only by birds, the occasional boat motor, and the wind moving across the water. What I did not expect was the chaos that one person, a woman who lived nowhere near me but believed she owned the right to police everything around her, would drag directly to my front door. The drive to the cabin was uneventful. I carried only essentials, planning to stock up at the nearest town when needed. When I reached the driveway, I paused to take in the view, the gravel path curving down toward the weathered wood of the cabin that still smelled faintly of cedar. The lake shimmered beyond it, reflecting a perfect late summer sky. I exhaled, the stress lifting from my shoulders almost immediately. I thought to myself, this is exactly where I need to be. I spent the first evening unpacking and wandering through the property. The cabin was simple, built solid by my grandfather, with a wraparound porch that had been repaired more times than I could count. The dock stretched into the lake, weathered but stable, with a small boathouse that leaned slightly to one side. I remembered fishing here as a child, swimming until my fingers wrinkled, and watching the stars as if the universe had been placed directly above us. I slept soundly that night, convinced nothing could disturb the peace I had returned to. The next morning, however, I saw the first sign of trouble. A car I didn't recognize pulled slowly past the cabin. It wasn't unusual for people to drive by. There were a few other cabins along the lake. But this car slowed almost to a crawl, the driver leaning forward as if inspecting the property. I thought little of it until it circled back 20 minutes later, again creeping past with the same curious eyes. I brushed it off, telling myself people were nosy, and turned back to fixing coffee. By mid-afternoon, I was outside stacking firewood when I heard voices on the gravel. A woman stood at the edge of my driveway with a teenage boy beside her. She was dressed in what I could only describe as suburban combat gear. Oversized sunglasses, a sun hat pulled too tightly, and an attitude that practically radiated from her posture. The boy shuffled awkwardly, clearly dragged into whatever mission she had declared important that day. She pointed toward me but did not step closer, speaking loudly enough that the words carried over the distance. I could not make out every detail, but the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, demanding, the kind of voice used by someone convinced they had authority. The boy shifted uncomfortably, muttering something that seemed like an attempt to calm her. But she snapped back at him and then waved her arms in my direction. I could feel her eyes drilling into me, though the sunglasses hid them. I turned away, refusing to engage. Years of dealing with people like her had taught me that ignoring was sometimes the best defense. Still, I couldn't help but feel a chill. Something told me she would not simply walk away. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the lake, I heard the crunch of gravel again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I stepped onto the porch and saw the same woman standing directly in the driveway, the boy nowhere in sight. She held her phone high, pointing it like a weapon. Even without hearing the words, I could tell what she was doing. She was recording. She circled slowly, narrating loudly enough for anyone within earshot. She spoke about suspicious activity and strangers trespassing. My name, of course, was nowhere in her vocabulary. To her, I was simply the intruder. I stood silently, arms crossed, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a response. After a few minutes of ranting, she stormed back to her car and sped away, dust billowing behind her. I told myself it was over. Perhaps she was simply one of those people who needed to feel important, and by recording something, she had convinced herself she had done her civic duty. I tried to relax, cooked dinner, and settled in with a book as night fell. But the next morning, everything escalated. I awoke to the sound of sirens. Not the distant wail of ambulances or fire trucks, but the sharp, immediate cry of a police cruiser pulling directly into my driveway. I rushed to the window, my stomach sinking. Two officers stepped out, one already speaking into his radio. Behind them, the same car from before appeared again. The woman climbed out with a dramatic flare, her sunglasses replaced by a triumphant glare. I stepped outside calmly, determined to keep the situation under control. The officer at the front raised his hand, telling me to stay where I was. His tone was official, but not aggressive, and I obeyed. He glanced at me, then at the woman, who was already spewing a stream of words, pointing frantically and motioning toward the cabin. She clutched her son's arm as if parading him as a witness. The boy looked mortified, staring at the ground. The officer's face shifted as he listened. At first, it was neutral, the kind of blank expression law enforcement often wears. But then something changed. His brows furrowed, and he looked from the woman to me with an expression that was almost disbelief. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Then, in a moment I will never forget, he straightened his posture, clicked his heels together slightly, and brought his hand to his forehead in a crisp salute. His voice carried across the driveway, firm and unmistakable. "Yes, Major General." The woman's mouth fell open. Her phone nearly slipped from her hand. The boy's eyes shot up in surprise, staring between me and the officer as if he had suddenly stepped into an entirely different world. I said nothing, allowing the silence to do the work for me. The officer lowered his salute, his expression respectful, almost apologetic. The woman stammered, trying to regain her composure, but it was too late. The dynamic had shifted completely. What she had thought was an opportunity to expose an intruder had turned into something far more humiliating. She had called the police on someone she believed was squatting in a cabin, only to discover she had summoned them to the property of a decorated major general. But this was not the end of the story. This was only the beginning, because once Karen realized her mistake, she didn't back down. She doubled down. The shock of the salute hung in the air like a storm that had stalled over the lake. The officer's gesture had said everything that words could not. To him, I wasn't a suspicious trespasser or a squatter. I was someone who had worn the uniform, carried the weight of command, and earned respect through service. The woman, however, didn't see it that way. She saw humiliation, and humiliation is something people like her never tolerate. Her son tugged at her sleeve, whispering, pleading for her to leave, but she shoved his hand away and stepped forward with renewed fury. Her voice rose higher, sharper, trembling not with fear but with indignation. She demanded to know why the officer was saluting me. She demanded to know how he could possibly take sides so quickly. She waved her phone again, recording as if proof of her outrage would vindicate her later. The officer attempted diplomacy. He explained calmly that I was not only the rightful owner of the property, but also someone who had earned a title that commanded respect. He advised her to leave, to stop harassing me, and to consider herself warned. But she wasn't listening. People like her never listen. They don't hear, they rehearse. She was already spinning her next performance, rehearsing the version of events she would tell anyone who would listen, reshaping herself as the victim. She finally stormed off with her son in tow, her car tearing down the gravel road with such speed that rocks sprayed against the trees. The silence that followed was thick. The officers gave me apologetic looks, assured me they would make note of the incident, and suggested I keep my phone handy in case of further issues. Then they left. I wanted to believe that was the end of it. But deep down, I knew better. For 2 days, the cabin returned to peace. I chopped wood, fished on the lake, and took long walks under the tall pines. The air was crisp in the mornings, warming by midday, and the sunsets painted the water in gold. For those brief hours, I let myself believe the drama had passed. But Karen, because that was the only name that fit her, wasn't done. On the third day, her car reappeared, not creeping by this time, but parked boldly at the edge of my driveway. She remained inside for nearly half an hour, phone in hand, occasionally lifting it as if taking photos. When I finally stepped onto the porch, she sped off again. The following morning, I found printed flyers shoved under the porch steps, plastered on the community bulletin board at the entrance of the lake road, and even tacked to the trees along the walking paths. Each flyer carried the same accusation. "Suspicious man squatting at lakeside cabin. Protect our neighborhood." Some included blurry photos clearly taken from her car, showing me stacking wood or walking to the dock. It was laughable, except that it wasn't. I knew how rumors worked. A lie repeated often enough becomes a kind of truth to those who want to believe it. Karen wasn't just trying to annoy me, she was trying to isolate me, to paint me as a danger, to rally others to her side. By the end of the week, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere around the lake. Neighbors who had once waved politely now hesitated. Some averted their eyes. One man even turned his truck around rather than pass me on the gravel road. Karen was working quickly, and her web of lies was catching people in it. I could have confronted her, but I didn't. Years in service had taught me patience. Battles are not won by charging blindly at the enemy, but by waiting for the right moment, the right pressure point. Instead, I documented. I photographed every flyer, every car parked suspiciously close, every instance of harassment. I knew that evidence, not anger, would dismantle her. Still, Karen's obsession grew bolder. Late one evening, just after dusk, I caught the glint of a flashlight moving along the edge of my property. I stepped quietly to the porch, watching as she crept near the dock, her phone raised again. She was filming, narrating in hushed tones about illegal activities and trespassing at night. The irony of her trespassing while accusing me of it would have been comical if it weren't so invasive. I cleared my throat loudly. The beam of her flashlight jerked and she froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she bolted, stumbling, over the uneven ground, scrambling back to her car and tearing off into the night. The next morning, another police cruiser arrived. This time, it wasn't a casual visit. The officer stepped out, holding a folded stack of complaints. Karen had filed multiple reports alleging everything from noise disturbances to illegal hunting to intimidation. The officer was professional, even sympathetic, but explained that they were required to follow up on citizen complaints. He asked routine questions, took a brief look around the property, and left with a weary shake of his head. It was clear. Now, Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't embarrassed by the salute, or by the truth of ownership, or by the officer's warnings. If anything, those moments fueled her. She had convinced herself that she was right, and when people like her believe they're right, reality bends around their narrative. By the end of that week, I received my first legal notice. A letter arrived from a local attorney's office claiming to represent a concerned neighborhood coalition. It alleged that I was occupying the cabin illegally, that my presence posed security concerns, and that I should vacate immediately or face civil action. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Karen had escalated from police to community to lawyers, building her campaign step by step. It was only a matter of time before she would push it even further. And she did. 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of engines. Multiple vehicles pulled into the gravel clearing near the lake entrance. Headlights pierced through the trees, voices carried across the water. I stepped onto the porch and saw a small crowd gathering, led by Karen at the front, her phone once. Again in hand, live streaming the entire spectacle, she had rallied people to her cause. Whether they believed her lies or simply enjoyed the drama, they followed her. And now, they were standing at the edge of my property, demanding answers, demanding action. Karen shouted that she would expose me, that she would take back the neighborhood, that she would not rest until I was gone. It was no longer just a nuisance. It was a siege. I stood silently on the porch, the night air heavy around me, the crowd buzzing with tension. My patience had limits, and she was pressing against them. I knew the next move would have to be mine, but it wouldn't be loud and it wouldn't be reckless. It would be precise. Karen had declared war, and I was ready. The scene that unfolded on that humid summer night would be etched in my memory forever. Karen stood at the front of the mob she had gathered, her phone glowing as she live-streamed the event for anyone willing to watch. Behind her were cars, parked haphazardly along the gravel clearing, headlights spilling into the trees. Around a dozen people lingered uncertainly, some crossing their arms in silent support, others shifting awkwardly as if unsure how they had been dragged into this spectacle. Yet Karen was undeterred. She raised her voice like a commander addressing troops, calling me a squatter, a trespasser, and a threat. From the porch, I remained calm. Years of service had hardened me to intimidation. A small crowd, armed with nothing but smartphones and Karen's shrill outrage, was hardly the most threatening standoff I had faced. But I knew appearances mattered. To them, I was just one man. To Karen, I was her target, her obsession. She thrived on escalation, and by gathering this group, she believed she had cornered me into submission. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I stepped back into the cabin, closed the door, and quietly picked up my phone. Documentation remained my weapon of choice. I dialed the non-emergency line and calmly explained that a group had gathered on my property under false pretenses. The dispatcher assured me an officer would arrive soon. Outside, Karen continued her tirade. She shouted about taking back the community, her voice trembling with self-righteous conviction. She walked back and forth in front of the crowd, brandishing her phone as if the stream gave her authority. The faces behind her were mixed, some nodding, others whispering to each other, a few clearly questioning why they had come. Karen didn't notice. She was too intoxicated by her own performance. Within half an hour, red and blue lights washed over the trees. A cruiser pulled into the driveway, then another. Officers stepped out, their body cameras flashing faintly in the dark. Karen turned her phone toward them triumphantly, announcing to her audience that the law was finally here to remove the intruder. Her smugness was palpable, but once again, her illusion shattered. The first officer approached me directly, saluting just as his colleague had days earlier. Respect was etched into his movements, his words steady as he addressed me as Major. General. Karen's triumphant expression faltered. The live stream caught every second of her disbelief, the moment when her narrative cracked in real time. The officer then turned to the crowd, his voice carrying authority. He explained that I was the lawful property owner, a decorated veteran, and that this gathering was not only unfounded, but trespassing. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A few people began to disperse immediately, muttering apologies as they hurried back to their vehicles. Karen's control over them slipped with every passing moment. She tried to recover, shouting that the officers were mistaken, that I must have forged documents, that this was all some elaborate cover-up. But her words rang hollow now. The crowd had seen the truth. The officers had confirmed it. Her live stream, meant to humiliate me, had instead broadcast her own humiliation to anyone watching. When the officers instructed her to leave, she refused at first, her hands trembling as she gripped her phone. But eventually, under the weight of authority and the stares of her dwindling supporters, she retreated. Her son, red-faced and ashamed, tugged at her arm until she finally stormed back to her car. One by one, the others followed, their engines revving as they scattered into the night. Silence returned to the cabin. The officers lingered a while longer, ensuring the situation was settled. One of them advised me to consider installing cameras, not for my safety, but to provide undeniable evidence of harassment. I thanked him, already planning to do so. The next day, I installed a network of discrete cameras around the property, motion-activated, weatherproof, and linked directly to my phone. They became my watchful eyes. With every alert, I felt a growing sense of control. If Karen returned, she would not just be seen, she would be recorded in high definition, her every move captured and time-stamped, and she did return. 2 nights later, the cameras lit up with movement near the dock. I watched in real time as Karen crept across the property again, this time with a flashlight and a small group of followers. They whispered as they moved closer to the boathouse, pointing, gesturing, clearly searching for something to justify their claims. They found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. But that didn't stop them from fabricating. Next morning, Karen's newest post appeared online. Edited clips from her nighttime intrusion, framed with captions accusing me of hiding illegal contraband at the cabin. She spoke with absolute certainty, weaving a narrative so bold it almost sounded believable, at least to those who wanted to believe it. But she had overlooked one crucial detail. My cameras had captured the entire event, unedited, unfiltered, undeniable. I waited. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I compiled the footage, layered with timestamps and clear evidence of trespassing. When I finally released it, the effect was devastating. Viewers who had once entertained her stories turned against her. Neighbors who had avoided me began stopping by, embarrassed by their earlier hesitation, apologizing for believing her lies. Karen, however, did not apologize. She doubled down again, insisting the footage was doctored, that I was manipulating technology to frame her. But the more she protested, the more desperate she appeared. Her live streams dwindled in viewers. Her flyers disappeared from bulletin boards, and her influence shrank. Yet she was far from finished. People like her don't retreat gracefully. They plot, they scheme, and when cornered, they lash out harder than ever before. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the lake shimmered with its last golden light, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel once more. I expected her car, but this time it was a delivery truck. The driver approached, asking me to confirm an order of lumber and construction materials. I hadn't ordered anything. Karen had. She had placed the order under my name, sending thousands of dollars worth of materials to the cabin in an attempt to create chaos. The driver, confused but professional, canceled the delivery when I explained. But the message was clear. She was escalating again, moving from rumors and trespassing to direct sabotage, and I knew the next move she made would cross a line she couldn't return from. The siege at the cabin wasn't just about reputation anymore. It was about endurance. She was testing mine, convinced she could break me, convinced she could drive me out through sheer persistence. But what she failed to understand was that I had weathered storms far fiercer than her tantrums, Karen thought. She was leading a battle. What she didn't know was that I had already begun preparing for war. The fake lumber delivery was the turning point. Until then, Karen's actions had been annoying, disruptive, and even humiliating for her. But this was different. This was fraud. Ordering thousands of dollars worth of materials under my name wasn't just petty harassment, it was a crime, and crimes leave trails. I reported the incident immediately. The driver provided paperwork with the forged order, complete with my name and the cabin's address written in sloppy handwriting. The police took the report seriously this time, photographing the documents and promising an investigation. Karen probably thought she was clever, but what she had really done was hand me undeniable proof of malicious intent. The next week was quiet, almost suspiciously so. The cabin sat in silence, the lake serene, the air heavy with late summer warmth. I spent my mornings fishing and my afternoons repairing the boathouse roof, determined not to let her obsession dictate my life. But in the stillness, I knew she was plotting. People like Karen don't vanish, they regroup. Sure enough, a letter arrived. This time it wasn't just another flyer or community gossip. It was an official-looking envelope stamped with the letterhead of a local law firm. Inside was a notice of civil action, A lawsuit claiming I was illegally occupying the cabin, that I had no rightful ownership, and that I had caused emotional distress to Karen and her so-called coalition. I almost laughed as I read it. Emotional distress? From what? Her own delusions? But as ridiculous as it was, lawsuits cannot simply be ignored. They demand response, attention, time, and money. That was her strategy, to drown me in paperwork, to exhaust me through legal attrition. Unfortunately for her, she had chosen the wrong opponent. My family had kept meticulous records of the cabin's history, from the original deed signed by my grandfather to every tax receipt and maintenance invoice across decades. Within hours, I had compiled a file so thick it could have served as a doorstop. My attorney, a calm and steady man I had known for years, reviewed it with a smile. His words were reassuring. "She doesn't have a case. This will collapse in court." But Karen wasn't aiming for victory in the courtroom. She was aiming for spectacle. She wanted headlines, attention, and the chance to spin herself as a martyr. And when the first court date was set, she arrived exactly as I expected. Sunglasses perched high, hair pulled tight, and a gaggle of supporters trailing behind her like a personal entourage. She spoke loudly in the courthouse lobby, her phone once again live streaming. She painted herself as the defender of the community, bravely standing up against an intruder who had intimidated her, harassed her, and, according to her wildest fabrication yet, threatened her son. Every word was a lie, but she told it with conviction, the kind that convinces those who don't bother questioning. When the case was called, the contrast could not have been starker. Karen strutted into the courtroom, armed with rhetoric and indignation. I entered with documentation, evidence, and quiet composure. My attorney presented deeds, tax records, military service documents, and sworn statements from neighbors who had known my family for decades. Karen, in contrast, offered nothing but accusations, hearsay, and dramatic outbursts. The judge was patient at first, allowing her to speak, but as her claims grew wilder, accusing me of forging military records, of running illegal operations, from the cabin, of being part of some grand conspiracy, the judge's patience thinned. By the end, Karen was red-faced, her words stumbling, her narrative collapsing under the weight of reality. The case was dismissed within an hour. The judge even issued a stern warning about filing frivolous lawsuits, hinting at penalties if she persisted. Karen's live stream cut off abruptly afterward, her followers left in stunned silence, and her carefully constructed image of victimhood cracked further. But defeat did not humble her. If anything, it enraged her. And when rage fuels someone, like Karen, they don't retreat, they escalate. The very next day, I woke to the sound of hammers. Across the lake, Karen and a group of her remaining supporters were constructing something, a massive, garish signboard erected at the roadside where everyone entering the lake community would see it. Painted in bold, sloppy letters were the words warning, dangerous trespasser at cabin 14, my cabin, my family's property. She had taken her campaign public louder than ever, unwilling to accept defeat in silence. At first, I considered tearing it down myself, but I knew better. That's what she wanted, for me to lash out, to give her another chance to play the victim. Instead, I documented it again. Photos, videos, timestamps, everything. Then I called my attorney. Within 48 hours, a cease and desist order was filed, citing defamation and harassment. Karen was served the papers in full view of her neighbors. She tried to turn it into another performance, shouting about intimidation and corruption. But the cracks in her influence were widening. People were growing tired of her theatrics, embarrassed by the drama she dragged into the community. Still, she pressed on. She shifted tactics once again, this time financially. Reports began circulating online claiming I owed back taxes on the property, that I was under investigation for fraud, that the military had stripped me of my rank. All lies, of course, but lies spread quickly on the internet. And Karen knew how to fan the flames. She contacted local reporters, feeding them her twisted version of events. A small-town paper even ran a brief article questioning ownership of the cabin, quoting Karen as a concerned neighbor. Though the piece was vague and speculative, the damage was real. Strangers now whispered, rumors multiplied, and my quiet retreat had become a battleground for my reputation. It might have broken someone else, but not me. Every time she attacked, she revealed more of herself. Every false claim, every exaggerated performance, every fabricated document became another piece of evidence, and I was collecting it all, building a case not just to defend myself, but to dismantle her entirely. The moment would come when she would step too far, when her obsession would cross the final line between nuisance and liability. And when that moment came, I would be ready, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with precision. Because while Karen saw this as a game, a stage for her self-importance, I saw it for what it was, a war of endurance. And endurance was something I had mastered long before she ever decided to make me her enemy. Karen thought the lawsuit was her greatest weapon. She was wrong. She hadn't yet realized that the true battle, the one she could never win, was only just beginning. By the time autumn began to creep into the pines around the lake, Karen's campaign had grown frantic. The lawsuit had failed, the cease and desist order had embarrassed her, and her credibility within the community had crumbled. Yet instead of fading away quietly, she clawed harder, desperate to reclaim control over a situation that had already slipped from her hands. Her obsession no longer had the veneer of community concern. It was personal now, vengeful, irrational, and dangerous. And I knew it was only a matter of time before she crossed a line she could never step back from. It began with small acts of sabotage. One morning I woke to find deep scratches etched across the side of my truck, deliberate and unmistakable. A few days later, the padlock on the boathouse had been smashed, tools scattered and tossed into the lake. Each incident was petty on its own, but together they painted a clear picture. Karen wasn't just spreading lies anymore, she was taking action. I reported everything, of course. The officers knew the story well by now, some even rolling their eyes when her name came up. But without direct evidence, they couldn't act. Karen was careful, never leaving witnesses, never allowing her phone to capture her in the act. She was learning from her failures, becoming more calculated, and that made her all the more dangerous. Fortunately, I had prepared. My cameras were everywhere now, hidden in trees, mounted under the eaves of the cabin, even disguised as birdhouses along the dock. Each one silently recorded day and night, feeding into secure storage I could access instantly. And one evening, that preparation finally paid off. It was just past midnight when an alert pinged my phone. I opened the feed and watched in real time as Karen crept onto the porch. She wore dark clothing, her hair tied back, a flashlight clutched in one hand and a crowbar in the other. My chest tightened as I realized her intent. She wasn't there to record or trespass. She was there to break in. I stayed silent inside, the cameras doing their work. She pried at the doorframe, grunting softly as she tried to force her way in. When that failed, she circled the cabin, testing windows, pulling at screens, determined to gain entry. For nearly 20 minutes, she worked, her movements frantic, her frustration visible in every gesture. Finally, she hurled the crowbar into the yard and stormed off, muttering curses as she disappeared into the night. The footage was damning. I turned it over to the police the next morning, and this time, there was no hesitation. A warrant was filed and charges were prepared. Karen was arrested within days, the news spreading quickly through the community. For a brief moment, I thought, it was over. But Karen's arrest did not silence her. If anything, it amplified her. From the moment she posted bail, she positioned herself as a victim of corruption, claiming the footage was fabricated, that I had staged the break-in to frame her. She doubled down on her narrative, spinning it into a story of injustice. Online, her followers rallied again, smaller than before, but louder, more aggressive. They flooded forums with conspiracy theories, harassed my attorney's office with calls, and even drove by the cabin shouting insults. It was no longer just Karen. It was the mob she had cultivated, weaponized against me. The next escalation came swiftly. Late one night, I was jolted awake by the blare of horns. Multiple cars had pulled into the clearing, their headlights blasting through my windows. Shouts echoed across the property, accusations, threats, demands for me to leave. Some threw rocks at the cabin, the sharp cracks against the wood breaking the stillness of the night. I didn't react, not outwardly. I stood silently in the darkened living room, phone in hand, recording every second. My cameras captured the license plates, the faces, the chaos. Within minutes, I had called the police again, my voice calm even as the shouting grew louder outside. When the cruisers arrived, the mob scattered. Tires screeched, engines roared, and the night swallowed their retreat. But the damage was done. Not to the cabin, but to the illusion Karen had tried to maintain. Her concerned community now looked less like neighbors and more like a gang of vandals, and every one of them had been caught on camera. The following week, restraining orders were filed. Karen was forbidden from coming within 200 feet of my property. Several of her followers faced charges for trespassing and vandalism. The sheriff himself stopped by to assure me the department was tightening patrols around the lake. But even with legal walls closing in around her, Karen did not stop. She simply shifted tactics again. If she couldn't intimidate me directly, she would attack me indirectly, through reputation, through whispers, through lies whispered in places where cameras couldn't follow. Rumors spread of investigations into my finances, whispers that I had bribed the police, that my military record was falsified. None of it was true, of course, but truth mattered little when lies were repeated often enough. I began receiving anonymous letters, crude notes filled with threats and accusations. Packages arrived at the cabin, empty boxes, meant only to unsettle. Every move she made only added to the pile of evidence I was building. Every rumor, every act of vandalism, every trespass was documented, logged, and stored. Piece by piece, Karen was constructing her own downfall, too blinded by obsession to see it. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the final misstep, the one that would end it all. It was early morning when my phone buzzed with another camera alert. I opened the feed and froze. Karen wasn't alone this time. She had brought gasoline. I watched in disbelief as she sloshed it across the grass near the boathouse, her motions frantic, her muttering audible even through the microphone. Her intent was unmistakable. She wasn't here to record or harass. She was here to destroy. My call to the authorities was immediate, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. Within minutes, the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminated the trees, catching her in the act. She was tackled, handcuffed, and dragged away screaming about conspiracies and corruption. The evidence was overwhelming: video, audio, eyewitnesses. This time, there would be no quick release, no easy spin of the story. Karen had crossed the line from harassment into attempted arson, and the consequences would be severe. As the officers extinguished the small flames she had managed to spark, I stood on the porch, the weight of months of conflict pressing down on me. Karen's war had escalated from whispers to flyers, from lawsuits to sabotage, and now to fire. But in trying to destroy me, she had destroyed herself. Or so I thought. Because even as she sat behind bars, her influence lingered. Her followers weren't done. And the battle for peace at the cabin was not finished yet. Karen's arrest for attempted arson should have been the end. The sight of her being hauled away in handcuffs, her shouts echoing through the trees as officers extinguished the flames, felt like closure. Months of harassment, sabotage, and humiliation had culminated in one undeniable act of destruction. She could no longer twist the narrative, no longer pose as the victim. The evidence was ironclad, and yet, even with her behind bars, the ripples of her obsession spread outward. The followers she had cultivated over months did not simply vanish. Some melted away quietly, embarrassed by their association with her. Madness. But a small, dedicated core clung to her narrative, convinced she was a martyr of corruption, framed by me, protected by a system they believed was rigged. They kept her lies alive in online forums and whispered rumors in the community. For weeks, I lived in uneasy peace. The cabin, once a sanctuary, still carried the weight of her presence. Every creak of the wood at night, every flash of headlights on the gravel road, reminded me of the siege she had led. I walked the property daily, cameras humming silently, documenting even the smallest disturbances. I had learned not to underestimate her or those who followed her. Her trial was set for late autumn. The charges were serious: attempted arson, trespassing, harassment, defamation. My footage was at the center of the case, each clip played frame by frame, every timestamp meticulously verified. The prosecution built a timeline so airtight it left no room for doubt. Karen's defense, as expected, was bluster. She claimed the videos were fabricated, that I had staged everything to destroy her reputation. She pointed to her loyal followers as witnesses, though their testimonies crumbled under cross-examination. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with tension. Neighbors who had once entertained her lies now sat in the gallery, wide-eyed as the truth unfolded. Her son, dragged unwillingly into her madness from the very beginning, sat silently at the back, his face pale, his eyes downcast. His presence was a reminder that Karen's obsession had not only consumed her, but also scarred those closest to her. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Guilty. Karen was sentenced to several years in state prison, with additional fines for damages and legal fees. The judge's words were stern, condemning her for endangering lives and eroding the trust of her community. For the first time, Karen's bravado cracked. As the gavel fell, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed, and the woman who had once strutted with self-righteous fury was reduced to silence. It should have been satisfying, and in many ways, it was. Justice had been served, the lies dismantled, the siege broken. But the aftermath was not as simple as victory. The scars remained on the cabin, on the community, and on me. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. The scratches on the truck were buffed out, the boathouse repaired, the scorch marks near the dock scrubbed clean. I restored what she had tried to destroy, reclaiming the cabin piece by piece. Neighbors who had once avoided me began to approach, again offering apologies, baked goods, even quiet words of gratitude for standing firm when chaos threatened to consume us all. Slowly, the community healed. Yet there were moments of unease. Her loyalists still lingered online, spinning theories, clinging to the idea that she had been framed. Some drove by the cabin occasionally, slowing just enough to remind me that her influence, though diminished, had not disappeared entirely. But their numbers dwindled with each passing month, their voices fading into irrelevance. And then, one crisp winter morning, something unexpected happened. A knock at the door echoed through the cabin. When I opened it, Karen's son stood there. He was taller than I remembered, his posture straighter, though his face carried the weight of exhaustion. In his hands was a folded letter. She asked, "Me to give you this," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed conflict, shame, anger, and perhaps relief. He handed me the letter, then turned and walked away without another word. I held it for a long time before opening it. Inside, the handwriting was jagged, rushed, and desperate. Karen's words spilled across the page, a mixture of denial and reluctant admission. She insisted she had only wanted to protect the community, that she had been misunderstood. But between the lines, there was something else, a flicker of regret. She spoke of her son, of the embarrassment she had caused him, of the life she once had before her obsession consumed her. She never apologized directly, but the tone was different, less defiant, more broken. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, not as a keepsake, not as forgiveness, but as a reminder of how far obsession can drive someone, of how quickly lies can spiral into destruction, and of how endurance, patience, and truth can outlast even the fiercest storm. As winter settled over the lake, I found peace again. The cabin, once under siege, now stood strong and quiet, its walls carrying not just the scars of conflict, but also the strength of survival. I spent evenings by the fire, the crackle of logs mingling with the whisper of wind through the pines. The lake froze in patches, reflecting the pale light of the moon. And for the first time in months, I felt truly at home. Karen's name faded from conversation. Her followers drifted away, embarrassed by their loyalty to her madness. The community turned its focus back to normalcy. Barbecues in the summer, fishing tournaments on the lake, children riding bikes along the gravel road. Life moved on, as it always does, but I had learned something important in those long, chaotic months. Peace is not simply given, it is defended. And sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on distant fields, but in the places we call home. Against enemies who arrive not with weapons, but with lies, arrogance, and obsession. I had faced Karen's war and endured, not through anger or revenge, but through patience, documentation, and truth. And in the end, truth had been enough. As I stood on the porch one evening watching the sun sink behind the pines and the lake glow with its final golden light, I felt the weight finally lift. The siege was over. The cabin was mine. And no matter how loud the lies had once been, silence had returned at last.